The fire marshal asked me to step outside, and I knew before he said a word that they were going to try to pin it on my son. It was 11 at night. The smoke had cleared, but the smell still hung in the air. That sharp, wet ash stink that gets into your hair and stays there for days. I'd been standing in the gravel lot of my workshop for 2 hours, watching 3 decades of my life curl into black, and now a man in a reflective vest was leading me away from my own family, away from my parents who had driven up from Tucson the second they heard, and his face had that careful, official softness that means someone is about to be accused of something. "Ma'am," he said, "are you Renata Holloway?" I said yes. "And the young man inside, the one your father identified, that's your son? Cody." That was the moment the floor tilted. My father had identified my son. To the fire marshal. Before I'd even been allowed to speak. Let me back up, because none of this makes sense unless you understand who we were to each other before that night. I grew up the older of 2. My younger sister was the one the cameras loved. Even as a kid, she had that thing, that gloss, where adults would lean in and forget anyone else was in the room. By the time she was 19, she'd turned it into a career. Lifestyle stuff. Sponsored posts. The whole machine. My parents talked about her followers the way other parents talk about a kid getting into med school. And me, I was the one who was good with my hands and didn't need much. That was the story they told. Renata's so steady. Renata's the practical one. You never have to worry about Renata. What that actually meant was that I was the one nobody worried about, because I was the one who absorbed everything. When my sister wrecked her first apartment lease and skipped on 3 months' rent, I co-signed the next one. When she needed someone to drive her to the airport at 4 in the morning, I drove. When the family needed a place for Thanksgiving and nobody wanted to host, I hosted. I was useful. Being useful in my family was the same as being loved, and for a long time I couldn't tell the difference. I had Cody at 24. His father was gone before the 2nd trimester, and my family treated that the way they treated everything inconvenient about me, with a kind of pursed lip patience, like I'd tracked mud into a clean house. My sister, meanwhile, could do no wrong. She'd announce some half-baked business idea at dinner, and my mother would clasp her hands like she was witnessing the Sermon on the Mount. So I built my own thing, quietly. I'd always loved old furniture, the kind of pieces people throw away because they don't know what they're looking at. I taught myself to restore them. Took night classes, watched 1,000 hours of video, burned myself, cut myself, ruined 100 boards learning grain. And after years of working out of my garage, I finally signed a lease on a real workshop in a converted feed mill on the edge of town. 3,000 square feet, big enough for the restoration work and for the one piece that wasn't for sale. The piece was a 1912 Steinway Grand. I'd found it in an estate sale, water damaged and abandoned, and I'd spent 4 years bringing it back, not just the cabinet. I'd learned enough to rebuild the action, restring it, refinish the case to a mirror. It wasn't mine in the legal sense at first. It had belonged to the woman who taught piano to half this town for 60 years, and her family let me have it for almost nothing because they thought it was junk. By the time I was done, it was worth more than my truck and my workshop equipment combined, but that wasn't why I kept it. I kept it because every time I sat down at it, something in my chest unclenched. It was the only thing I'd ever made that was just for me. My son knew not to touch it. Cody was 17, a quiet kid, the kind who'd rather take apart a lawnmower than go to a party. He worked in the shop with me on weekends. He had a key because he was responsible enough to have a key. That was the whole point of him. Now here's where my sister comes back in. She'd been having a rough year. The sponsorships had thinned out. Turns out the internet moves on, and she'd gotten it into her head that she needed to rebrand. Reinvent herself as something more elevated, tasteful. And somewhere in that fog, she decided that what she needed was to throw a launch party, an intimate salon evening, she called it, for 40 of her remaining contacts, and a couple of brand reps she was trying to woo. She needed a venue that looked authentic, lived in, artisanal. She wanted my workshop. I said no. She wanted my workshop. I said no. I said it kindly the first time and less kindly the fourth time. The shop was full of clients' pieces, antiques worth tens of thousands of dollars that didn't belong to me. There were finishes curing, solvents in open containers, sawdust everywhere. It was not a party venue. It was a working shop with real liability and real things in it that could be ruined. She went to our parents. Of course she did. My mother called me and used the voice, the disappointed one, and said it would mean so much. And your sister never asks you for anything, which was such a staggering inversion of reality that I actually laughed out loud on the phone. I held my ground. I told my mother the answer was no, and it was going to stay no. And then I made the mistake that I will think about for the rest of my life. I went out of town. It was just for 2 nights. A furniture auction. 3 hours north, the kind I went to maybe twice a year to find inventory. Cody had a robotics thing at school and was staying with a friend. The shop was locked. I had cameras. 4 of them, interior and exterior, that I'd installed for insurance reasons after a break-in 2 years back. I checked the app once before bed the first night out of habit, saw the dark, empty shop, and didn't think about it again. My sister had a key. I'd forgotten she had a key. Years ago, during one of my useful periods, I'd given her one so she could let a delivery in when I couldn't be there. I never got it back. I never thought to. She threw the party in my workshop while I was gone. I know exactly what happened because I watched all of it later, frame by frame, more times than was healthy. 40-odd people in cocktail clothes. Catered trays balanced on my workbenches. Someone set a clutch purse down on a client's 19th century writing desk that I'd just refinished and left a ring in the wax. Wine on the floor, and in the corner near my dust collection system, which anyone who has ever worked with wood will tell you is essentially a tank of finely powdered fuel. Somebody lit a cluster of those tall taper candles for ambiance. I will never know whose elbow knocked the candle over. The footage doesn't show it cleanly. What it shows is the flame catching the edge of a drop cloth, then a wreck of rags soaked in linseed oil. And if you don't know about linseed oil, you should know it can ignite on its own when it's bunched up. It generates heat as it cures. It is the single most common cause of woodshop fires in the country. The flame found the rags found the finishing station, and within 90 seconds the whole back third of the shop was gone. Everyone got out. That's the one mercy. Nobody was hurt, but 40 drunk people scattered into the night, and by the time the fire department arrived, the only person still standing in the gravel lot was my son. Because my sister had called him. Around 9:30 that night while the party was still going, she'd called Cody and told him there was a problem at the shop, and he needed to come right away and not tell his mom because she'd handle it. He's 17. His aunt called him sounding panicked. He got a ride over. He walked into a building that was already starting to smoke, looking for the emergency she'd described, and that's where the first responders found him. A teenage boy alone at the scene of a fire with a key to the building in his pocket and no adults anywhere. My sister was gone, so were all 40 guests. She'd made one phone call as she left, and it wasn't to me, and it wasn't to 911. It was to her parents, to get the story straight. By the time I made the 3-hour drive back, white-knuckled the whole way, a narrative had already set like concrete. My son had let himself into the shop with his key. My son had been doing something he shouldn't. Vaping, maybe, or messing with equipment. The details were left conveniently vague. My son had caused the fire, and my responsible, devoted sister had rushed over the moment she got a frantic call from her nephew, and had been the one to make sure he got out alive. She'd recast herself as the hero. She'd recast my son as the arsonist. And my parents backed it. Every word. When I got to the lot, my father met me before I could reach Cody. He put his hands on my shoulders and said in this low, urgent voice that we needed to be smart about this, that the insurance investigation was going to be serious, that a 17-year-old wouldn't face the kind of consequences an adult would, and that the family just needed to stay aligned. Those were his words. Stay aligned. My sister had a brand to think about, he said. A fire at her event would follow her forever. But a kid. Kids make mistakes. It would blow over for Cody. I looked at my son standing in the blue strobe of the fire truck, stood on his face, shaking. And I understood with perfect clarity what my father was asking me to do. He was asking me to let my child carry the blame for a crime my sister committed so that her Instagram engagement wouldn't take a hit. I want to tell you I exploded. I didn't. Something colder than that happened. I felt myself go very quiet and very still, the way the air gets before a storm, and I said, "Get away from me." Just that. My father blinked like I'd slapped him. The fire marshal pulled me aside a few minutes later, and that's where I started this story. He asked if Cody was my son. He asked me to confirm what my father had told him. And I looked that man in the eye and I said, "My father wasn't here tonight. My son wasn't here when this started. I'd like to show you something," and I took out my phone. Here's a thing nobody in my family knew, because nobody in my family ever paid attention to the boring, practical things I did. The cameras weren't just recording locally, they backed up to the cloud in real time automatically. The system had been quietly streaming the entire party to a server while it happened. 40 people. The candles. My sister directing the caterers. My sister on video with a timestamp. Hours before my son ever arrived, I handed the marshal my phone and I played it for him right there in the gravel lot. And I watched his expression change from official sympathy to something much harder. Then I turned the phone around so my parents could see the screen. I have spent my whole life watching my parents' faces light up for my sister. I had never once seen them look the way they looked in that moment. The blood just left them. My mother reached for my father's arm. My father opened his mouth and nothing came out, because the story they'd spent 2 hours building, the story they'd handed to a fire investigator, the story that put their own grandson on the hook for felony arson, that story had just been deleted in front of them by 12 seconds of footage with a timestamp on it. My mother started. Renata. Is that streaming somewhere? That was her first question. Not, is Cody okay? Not, what have we done? Her first instinct, standing in the wreckage, was to ask whether the evidence could be contained. I said, "It's already saved. It's already backed up in 3 places, and the marshal has it now." The fallout was fast and total. The fire investigation found exactly what the footage showed: an unpermitted private event, open flame candles next to combustible materials, improperly stored oily rags, and an organizer who fled the scene and attempted to misdirect investigators. My sister had hosted a commercial event in a space she had no right to use, lied to first responders, and made a deliberate effort to frame a minor. My parents had knowingly given false statements to a fire marshal. That last part is not a small thing. That is a crime, and they are not young, and watching them realize that in real time was something I felt nothing about, which surprised me. My son was cleared completely within 48 hours. The footage proved he'd arrived after the fire was already underway, that he'd been lured there by a phone call, and that he had, in fact, been the one who pulled a fire extinguisher off the wall and tried to fight it before a firefighter dragged him out. The boy they tried to call an arsonist had run toward the fire. That detail made it into the official report, and I have read it more times than I'll admit. My sister was charged, reckless burning, filing a false report, and the insurance company filed civil action on top of the criminal side once they reviewed the footage and refused her any sympathy. She did not go to prison. I'll be honest about that, because I know that's the part people always want. But she pled to the lesser charges, got probation and a felony on her record, and was ordered to pay restitution that she does not have and will be paying for the rest of her natural life. The brand she was trying to rebuild is gone. You cannot quietly rebrand around a felony arson plea. The internet, which had moved on from her, came back just long enough to make sure everyone knew. My parents avoided charges by the thinnest margin, only because the marshal believed their lawyer's argument that they'd repeated my sister's version in panic rather than calculation. I don't believe that, and neither does the marshal, but I let it go. There was nothing left to win there. I haven't spoken to them since the day the restitution check from the settlement cleared. They sent a card on Cody's 18th birthday. He didn't open it. I didn't push him to. The insurance, once the arson question was resolved in our favor, covered the building and most of the client pieces, and the clients whose antiques were lost were made whole. That mattered to me more than almost anything. Those were other people's heirlooms held in trust, and I couldn't have lived with myself if my family's mess had cost a stranger their grandmother's desk. The Steinway burned. I want to be honest about that, because it's the part of the story that doesn't have a clean ending. 4 years of my life, the only thing I ever made just for myself, gone in the back corner of the shop where the rags were stored. I didn't cry about the workshop. I didn't cry about my family, but I sat in my truck in that lot at 2 in the morning and cried about the piano. And if you've ever made something with your own hands that nobody else understood the value of, you know exactly why. We rebuilt. It took most of a year and most of the settlement, but the shop is open again, in a better building, with a sprinkler system and a sign-in log and no spare keys floating around in anyone's purse. Cody works with me still. He's 19 now, taking community college classes in the mornings and learning the trade in the afternoons, and he's better at the fine work than I was at his age. People come from 2 states over for his inlay work. I don't think about my sister much anymore, which is its own small miracle. For a long time I thought walking away from family was the worst thing a person could do, that it made you cold, that it made you the villain in your own story. My whole life I'd been told I was the strong one, and it took me until I was 33 to understand that strong in my family had never meant strong. It meant convenient. It meant the one you could pile things onto. It meant the one who'd never make a scene. Choosing my son over the people who raised me was not cold. It was the warmest thing I've ever done. I just had to set fire to an old idea of who I was supposed to be to see it. Last spring, Cody found another wrecked piano at an estate sale, a 1920s upright, cracked soundboard, keys yellow as old teeth. He bought it with his own money and didn't tell me until it was already in the back of the truck. He said he wanted us to rebuild it together. It's sitting in the shop right now, half finished, and some evenings after we close, we sit out back with the doors open and he plays the few chords he's learned on the half-strung thing. And it sounds terrible, and I would not trade that sound for anything in the world. For 33 years, I let the word strong do something to me that I never noticed until it was almost too late. In my family, it was a leash, not a compliment. Every time my parents called me the steady one, the practical one, what they really meant was that I was the one who would carry the weight without complaint, the one who could be handed the bill while my sister was handed the spotlight. And the strange part is that I believed them. I thought being useful was the same as being loved, and I let that belief talk me into co-signing leases and driving to airports at 4 in the morning and hosting every holiday nobody else wanted. The fire didn't start the night my sister knocked over a candle. It had been smoldering my whole life. The candle just gave it a shape I could finally see. What I've come to understand is that everything that happened in that gravel lot was the harvest of seeds planted years before. My sister learned she could do anything because there were never consequences. My parents learned they could rewrite reality because I always let them. And I learned far too late that staying silent isn't peace. It's just permission. Cause and effect doesn't care about family. The moment they tried to hang felony on a 17-year-old boy to save an Instagram brand, the chain of every small surrender I'd ever made finally reached its end, and I had to decide whether to break it or keep paying on it forever. I think there are 3 things that saved my son that night, and I didn't have all 3 until that exact moment. The first was the simple refusal to let an innocent kid carry a guilty person's weight, the line inside me that finally said no further. The second was something quieter and easier to overlook. I'd installed those cameras for boring, ordinary reasons, kept them backing up, paid attention to the dull, practical details nobody else in my family ever respected. Clear thinking, done in advance, is what turned a story into evidence. And the third was the nerve to stand in that lot with my parents and a fire marshal all looking at me and actually pull out the phone instead of folding the way I always had. Conscience tells you what's right. Good judgment shows you how to prove it, but it takes real backbone to do it when the people who raised you are begging you to look away. If I could hand my son one thing from all of this, it wouldn't be the rebuilt shop or the settlement. It would be the understanding that decency, a clear head, and the steel to act on both have to travel together, because any one of them alone gets you nowhere. Renata, the practical one, finally figured that out at 33, in the worst night of her life. I hope Cody learns it somewhere gentler. Some evenings listening to him pick out chords on that half-strung upright, I let myself believe he already has.